Yeah, I hear a little bit of one.
Okay, how about now?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, maybe
I'll
go on
my computer. Let me try it there.
Okay. Maybe mute one of the mics, if whichever one you're on, like mute the other one.
It was.
I think I just fixed it. Try talking, Kat.
Okay, how about now? Oh, yeah.
Perfect.
I think that's better. Okay, hi, everybody. This is Kat. Just wanted to say welcome to everyone who's on the webinar. I see there's 23 attendees. That's very exciting. So my name's Kat Griffith. I am going to start this off. Just welcome. So for those of you who are new, double welcome. And for those of you, this is your second webinar. This is just really awesome. We've been really excited for this work. So just so you know, I'm Kat Griffith. I am on the board of the Positive Women's Network USA, and the group that we are putting together this webinar and this whole series is the Women of PWN, Dismantling Racism. The webinar is Language, Power, and Privilege. Today's date, obviously, is March 30th of 2017. So the overall objectives of today's webinar are to build an understanding of how language impacts power, privilege, and racism, to identify different types of language and their impacts on power and privilege, and to share space and examples of the power of language when it comes to race, power, and privilege. So we have some fabulous presenters. I'll skip over me because I introduced myself. Kari loves this picture of me because I look better than usual. You see Kari Hartel, who is with PWN-USA Colorado. She's the co-chair. We have Tranisha Arzah, who's a peer advocate, and she's with the Babes Network and YWCA in Seattle. We have Olivia Ford, who is a freelance editor and writer and has been working with us for a while on staff and off. And Jenny Smith-Camejo, who is the PWN-USA Communications Director. So every single one of those fabulous women will have an opportunity to share with you and share their experience and their expertise. So when we were together in Florida in September, we came together as a group, as an affinity group, as a matter of fact, to really start the process of doing this work. So one of the things we came up with was our mission, and that is to create a space for open dialogue to address racism amongst ourselves and our communities in a spirit of cultural humility. We made a commitment. We acknowledge a long history of systemic racism, institutional privilege, as well as past and recent brutality. We are here with humility to stand in solidarity and hold safe space for our sisters and ourselves. We commit as white women to being uncomfortable in order to learn and grow as we challenge racism in ourselves and our community. We stand in sisterhood, solidarity, and action. One of the decisions that we made going into this work was that we were going to read that, both the mission and our commitment, at the beginning of every webinar so that we never forget why we're doing this work. So, as I mentioned, this is a webinar about language, power, and privilege. How we got here, at the PWN Summit, as I mentioned, we gathered a group of white women together as an affinity group to discuss ways to dismantle racism. As I mentioned before, we decided that we needed a long-term plan to really dive into gaining knowledge so that we could truly become fierce allies to our sisters of all colors and help be the solution to dismantling racism. We had an introductory webinar in which we set our goals and the purpose of this series of webinars and discussion groups. We really wanted a space for white women to learn and grow in a way that allows us to make mistakes, but challenges each of us to identify and challenge our own thoughts, beliefs, and ideas. We needed a safe space to talk about things that we are often afraid to talk about or are fearful that we might say the wrong thing. Language, power, and privilege are at the absolute base of almost all of those challenges, and we thought that it was an important basis for much of the work that we will do. That is why it is our first topic. One challenge we as white women struggle with generally is how to identify biased language, both in ourselves as well as in others. And once we identify that, then how do we call that out? And to take that a step forward, how do we move forward in a way that empowers us and helps us to adopt empowering language that is not based in stigma or racism? We want to truly move forward and learn to use language that empowers our sisters and puts us in solidarity so that we truly can be the allies that we see ourselves as. And so in working through some of these questions and challenges, I would like to hand the mic over to Olivia Ford so that she can share her experience and her expertise on the topic. Olivia?
Yes, Kat, thank you so much. Can everyone hear me? Uh-oh, I don't hear anybody saying yes. Okay, good. Everyone,
yes,
people,
yes, we can hear you.
Presenters and attendees can hear me. Okay, just wanted to make sure. Hello, hi, family. It's really, really, really a pleasure to be here. And
all attendees are muted, and may all attendees are muted.
Hello? Okay.
Yeah, we can
I don't
hear
think
you.
I'm muted, so I'm going to keep going. Okay, great. Just as I was saying, it's really, really wonderful to be part of this work. I was a witness to the launch of this initiative at the Speak Up Summit, and I know that it came out of a long kind of journey of conversations, and it was really beautiful to see the commitment of women who sort of committed to take part in Women of PWN Dismantling Racism. I remember everyone was very excited at Speak Up, and there was lots of applause when the initiative was launched, and I think that after we applauded, I think it was Pat Miglier, I'm not sure, Pat, if you're on the call, who said, clap for us when we start doing something, which I thought was a really powerful statement at the time. And y'all are doing something, which is really, and the work has been really beautiful to witness happening. It's very important work, and I've quoted it actually in other places as well, in kind of other intersectional parts of our community to tell them that the women of PWN are doing this, are really leading the way. So part of the reason that I sort of continue to feel so connected with HIV community work over many years is that it's this really, really radically diverse community of people who come from so many different experiences, who have been brought together by the shared experience of having a health condition or having loved ones who have a health condition that is treatable but is stigmatized, misunderstood. And part of what that means is that chances are anyone who's living with HIV, as we've talked about a lot, both in work that I've done with PWNers and as a staff member, anyone who's living with HIV has the experience of some measure of being marginalized or denied access to care or relationship, misunderstood, stereotyped because of it. And so, in my mind, I think this creates a potentially really rich foundation for empathy, an opportunity for listening to folks whose identities may be different in other ways, who may experience marginalization in other ways. And this is by no means to say that being, say, a person living with HIV is exactly the same as being a person of color who may not be living with HIV, just the same as, say, being a black person isn't the same as being a woman or being a queer person. So, of course, obviously one can be all three, as I, as a queer black woman, can certainly attest. But if a person has some experience of having been marginalized, having the kind of language assume that the community that they come from is not the dominant community or is a community that deserves not to be trusted or is misunderstood in some way, ideally that can become an asset to know how we don't want to be treated and how we do want to be treated, to know how important it is for others who may experience privilege in the aspect of identity that in which we may experience marginalization, really listen and take their lead from folks who are experiencing that, who don't experience privilege in that aspect of their identity, and to really apply that knowledge and that skill. I'm drifting. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Listening in areas. Okay. I'm not sure what the drifting piece means. Areas where they have a lot to learn from other people about others' experiences that may be different. So I'm here to talk a little bit about microaggressions and sort of microaggressive language. I've written about the topic for thebody.com. I've written a few times about kind of the intersections of kind of racism, sexism, and privilege specifically in the HIV community and elsewhere. And so a lot of, if you would like more information about this topic, there's a link at the end where it's to an article in which, and then I leave a few other articles as well, go into much more detail about the topic. Oh, you can hear clearly now. Okay, good. I'm holding the mic really close to my mouth, so hopefully, well, you know what, I'm going to turn my audio up a little bit too. So they're called microaggressions. If anyone has not heard the term, I'm actually curious to hear. If anyone has not heard the term microaggression, just sort of give a holler in the chat box, because I'm curious how the extent to which this term has kind of reached the wider community and whether people have heard it. I know that it's one that gets talked about a lot on campuses now with young folks who are coming into kind of college settings, and they, in a lot of places, are kind of getting early training on basically talking to people who may be and engaging with people who may be different from them, may have different experiences of the world than they do, and that may be a first for them being college students. The word is microaggressions. It's on the slide, and they're called micro because they tend to take place. These are kind of the everyday slights and indignities that people may experience. They're called small because they are kind of everyday, commonplace experiences, and they tend to happen within intimate groups often, but there's nothing really small about them, as we'll come to over the course of this presentation. The definition that I've put on this slide, which you can read in more detail there: brief and commonplace daily, verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, and we'll come back to that as well, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative slights and insults towards members of oppressed groups. That's from Kevin Nadal, who's done a lot of work around he's, I believe, a psychiatrist who's done a lot of work around how microaggressions impact a variety of different communities, whether the LGBT community, women, as well as racial minorities or people who are in racialized groups. It's important to note, I think it's important to note that the term was actually coined in the 70s by a psychiatrist named Chester Pierce, black psychiatrist, and he was talking specifically about the kind of anti-black or race-based kind of insults and slights that black people experience from non-black people. And it's definitely a term that applies across the board, but I just want to lift up the work of Chester Pierce. I believe he's no longer with us. But, I think that it's important to note that when, that example of research and work being done and prioritized by someone who's impacted by that research and has been impacted by the experience that they're describing, who recognizes that it's a pressing issue and then brings it, and publishes about it and talks about it and gives lectures and things about it. He saw these things happening and looked into it. Another example, just as an aside, I'm sure that maybe you've heard the term intersectionality, which is, people sometimes talk about in recent years as being a very new idea, but that was coined in 1989 by Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a black woman legal scholar, so who was impacted by intersectional experiences of oppression and published about it. So it's important for folks who are impacted by issues, as you all know, to speak about them and bring light to them where they have a platform. So microaggressions tend to fall into three categories. I always advise people don't get too much into the weeds trying to think about, well, was this a micro assault? Was it a micro insult? A micro assault tends to be a conscious, intentional, discriminatory action. Even if it's casual, using a derogatory term or staying away from someone. We'll get to examples on the next slide. A micro insult may be a kind of nonverbal communication or a comment that conveys insensitivity or rudeness. Micro-invalidation is really sort of a comment or communication that ignores, excludes, or dismisses the experiences or the feelings of people who are experiencing bias. So that's where we say, oh, this clearly you must be going a little bit crazy. Whatever you were experiencing wasn't a big deal. That's an example of a micro-invalidation. But again, like I said, those are the three categories, but it's not so much about defining which microaggression is which kind, just to give you a sense of how they shake out. And, one of these by themselves in a person's life may be shakeable, may not be such a big deal for one to experience, but just imagine experiencing over and over and over again these kinds of comments from different people in your own kind of circle, whether in your workplace, whether just out in public, whether at your school, whether in groups that you belong to. It can be extraordinarily damaging, and these are sentiments that are conveyed through people's language, and don't even realize it, as again we'll discuss later. And that's why microaggressions have been called death by 1,000 cuts, which sounds very dramatic, but it really conveys that feeling of just having a sense of real onslaught of some of these really these kind of offhand slights. Some of these you'll recognize perhaps as having been adapted from the first webinar, so I included some in for continuity's sake, some common ones. In some cases, someone may recognize that they do hold a measure of bias against a group of people, but may feel justified in it for some reason. They may express it publicly in a group. Like, for instance, when people say something like, oh, there were all these creepy black people around in the neighborhood, I could tell it wasn't a very good neighborhood. I don't know if there are some people on the call for whom this seems over the top, but that's a comment that has been made to me by a person who considers themselves liberal in our community very recently. So it's really the idea also that sometimes microaggressions can come in the form of compliments. Your hair is really beautiful. Can I touch it? Or just not even asking, just sort of reaching out and touching a person's hair. The person saying it or doing the action may really believe that they are making the person on the receiving end feel good. When, maybe they say, well, you're not like all those other people who get stopped by the cops for being black because I know you and you're really nice, or I know you and you have a job, or I know you and you're so well dressed, as if to say that there are people who deserve scorn and deserve oppression and those who don't, that there are some who are sort of quote unquote the good ones of the group that they belong to, which is a deeply, deeply dangerous idea. So, the examples that I've provided sort of fall into those different categories. And I mixed in some that are not specifically kind of racialized microaggressions, but that are similar around HIV status or gender, to see how this action of microaggressions and this practice can take many different forms that may be familiar across the board, but it is possible for people who are part of groups that experience microaggressions to also deliver them to other people. So again, just one of these by themselves may not be such a big deal, but it can become extraordinarily damaging to someone over time. Again, there's been some research in recent years around microaggressions. You may have had the experience maybe where, kind of just as quickly as a comment kind of like really got you in the heart or sucked you in the gut. You were just kind of like, ooh, what that person said really felt kind of funny, didn't really feel good. In that moment, maybe you explained away your reaction. Maybe you told yourself, the person didn't really mean anything by it. They were just trying to be nice. Maybe you're just being oversensitive. You may be a little bit concerned that the person will become defensive if you approach them. They may, it just may become a thing. Maybe they'll stop feeling comfortable around you. But the fact of the matter is you have become uncomfortable now in this interaction because you are having this experience internally. You know that you've been wounded, but you feel as if there's no way to address it in the moment and be heard. And you know that if maybe you don't approach the person, if you do, there may be a problem. If you don't, it's going to weigh on your mind. And it saps an enormous amount of energy. It's kind of like you're darned if you do and you're darned if you don't address microaggressions in the moment. And some of the effects of that, over time, again, research shows this is a continuing reality for people of color in day-to-day interactions. The invisibility of microaggressions also, research has shown that actually may make them more harmful than hate crimes or actions, of overt white supremacist groups. And something that I hear a lot in rebuttal to someone saying, I don't know what people are talking about when they say microaggressions. Those are just stupid things that people say. It's not like I'm burning a cross on your lawn. Or it's not like I'm a member of the KKK, or it's not like I'm Donald Trump, which is what I've heard a lot recently. Let's focus on the real bad guys. But you know what, though? There are kernels of these practices and these behaviors in all of us. 97% of thought is unconscious, which I'm going to get to later. But what we're doing here is bringing consciousness to some of those unconscious thought processes. But again, over time, microaggressions cause real harm. They lead people of color to feel excluded, untrustworthy, abnormal, untrusted, drains energy, as we said. It has mental health effects. It creates a hostile environment or an invalidating environment, can contribute, as stress tends to physical health problems. Microaggressions give cues to the broader society, to other listeners, that devalue certain people's identities. I see that folks are kind of sharing microaggressions in the chat box. I knew that folks would understand this practice because we've all experienced it in some kind of way, and that gives us the opportunity to have broader and richer thinking about how other folks experience microaggressions that we may not. They lower productivity and problem-solving ability. If people have so much, kind of problem-solving thought process around, do I address the fact that my boss just touched my hair in a meeting? Maybe they're not actually, be able to address problems in their actual work. They're distracting in a really dangerous way. And of course, they can underpin inequities in education, employment, and healthcare. These folks are this way, so clearly they don't really know what, they don't deserve these privileges, which we actually know are rights. So those are just a few effects. I also included a link to that article for more. There's some really interesting work written about microaggressions, which I'm just summarizing here, basically. So, we talked a little bit about the invisibility of microaggressions, the fact that, folks who are delivering them may not even know that they've said something that's offended someone, and that being part of is not actually a reason to say that they do not exist, but is a reason to pay even more attention to something that is so unconscious and yet so pervasive. In that spirit, let's talk about intent versus impact. And I will never stop saying, this is like I want to put this on a t-shirt. People's individual feelings and good intentions do not negate systemic oppression. So if you hear a comment about a systemic issue, like, I'm constantly stopped by the police. This is kind of, for example, I've been stopped by police in more states than I can count. If someone, kind of responds, well, I know a lot of cops that would be really nice to you. And if someone brings up a systemic issue and feels an urge to refute it based on a claim that begins with I or includes the phrase because I, then that is a false equivalency. Unless it's, I think you're right, and I would like to listen to you more about your experience. Of course, these comments and these slights are invisible. White supremacy is in the air that we breathe. We're like the fish swimming in the water. Fish don't see the water. We don't see the ways that white supremacy and racism play on our lives until we consciously see it. It doesn't go away by us not talking about it. So to anyone who says, this is sort of a common comment I think that comes up a lot on, it's come up in different ways on these trainings. When someone says, I'm not racist, my response is often, how would you possibly know? We certainly don't learn about the true pervasive nature of racism in school or in mainstream media. Our nation's most visible leaders have never been committed to addressing the roots and the effects of white supremacy in this country. So I don't really know where folks think that they are getting, folks who are not sort of engaged in anti-racist work feel that they're getting the information that they are not racist. And I think that what the phrase is meant to convey, this is how I've experienced it when it's been said to me, what I think it's meant to convey is I'm not a bad person. Because, racist to those on the receiving end of being called racist has become in many circles like kind of like a cuss word that has no meaning. For example, okay, trigger warning, I'm going to say an actual cuss word now. If someone calls you a motherfucker, are they literally saying that you have had relations with the person who gave birth to you? No, they're saying they think that you're a bad person. But the word has kind of been divorced of its actual meaning. Just like oftentimes the word racist has been divorced from its actual meaning. We throw it around, or people feel as if they're being called it for no reason. I know I don't want to offend people with my cussing, but words do mean things. And racism is not a word that I throw around like, say, Quentin Tarantino throws around the MF word. I'm very clear that I'm referring to a system that confers invisible safeties, value, and protections on some due to their whiteness, and withholds those safeties, value, and protection from those who are not white. And again, people experience different forms of oppression in different overlapping ways. So you may be privileged by whiteness and be profoundly oppressed by economic issues or by HIV status or gender. But again, we're talking right now about white supremacy. And again, the system withholds those safeties, value, and protections from those who are not white in different ways. And it damages the whole society because of the waste of human resources that comes from that violence and that devaluation. But here's a bonus tip. I understand that the statement "I'm not racist" is meant to make a person, is meant to make sort of people of color, black people, feel better, feel more comfortable around the white person who's speaking. But it actually does the opposite, because it tells me, as a black woman, that the person speaking hasn't really even started to think about the true systemic nature of racism, which means that they're highly likely to perpetuate that system in their words and in their actions, no matter how good their intentions, which is going back to intent versus impact, which we'll talk about. They're basically kind of what I think of as like a live mine of potential microaggression, because they haven't thought about or brought consciousness to that thought process around race. And again, 97% of thought is unconscious. Someone quoted recently, they said, "I'll see it when I believe it." I don't know if anyone's ever sort of heard that phrase. It's, I'll see it when I believe it. Things are invisible to people if they don't believe that they exist, even if they're right in front of them. And it can feel really treacherous to think that 97 of my thought process is unconscious and it derives from a system that oppresses people. Like that feels scary. I could be saying things that offend people all the time. You know what? I probably am. But this process is about bringing consciousness to that 97%. And I really want to encourage folks, it's been a practice for me too in different ways throughout my life. I really want to encourage folks to think about it as a reminder to strengthen your listening process. Bring that consciousness to the unconscious thought process we've been kind of habituated to. And to just reclaim some of that humanity that this kind of, and connection, and this kind of supremacy culture strips away from people who are framed as having privilege by leading them to believe they have nothing to learn from people whose experience is different. So basically, just quickly on intent versus impact, which I think you've also talked about perhaps on other webinars or maybe is going to be touched on a little bit later. The intent conversation is about, am I racist? Am I sexist? Who am I? What are you saying about me, the person who delivered the microaggression? But the impact conversation is about, well, what did I do? What did I do in this moment? Did I hurt other people? Did I contribute to their marginalization? And that impact conversation takes the person who did the hurtful thing out of the center and places the person who was hurt in the center. How can we take a step towards doing something different in the future, as opposed to, oh gosh, what am I? Am I a bad person? Am I a racist? No, but you know what? Let's learn something from this experience and do something different next time. What was the impact, and how can I lessen my impact later? There's a lot of great work about intent versus impact. There's a link to that article that I reference at the bottom there in the references. So finally, I'm going to end with some images and some pop culture intrigue. There's this brilliant film. Actually, I want to get a couple amens or, to be seen later in the chat box. Who has seen the film Get Out? Directed by Jordan Peele. He's a brilliant, not just a comedian, he's a social commentator. It's just a really, really smart film that takes place in the North with liberal white people, and it's about the kind of the horror of racism, of passive racism. And, what I thought was particularly brilliant about it is that it framed as horrible microaggressions in a lot of ways, other than the gory bit, which I won't spoil here, for those who may not have seen the movie, please see it. Oh my gosh, I'm about to go back and see it again. It was just really, it was really smart. I was just watching the chat box. But it's brilliant. But other than the kind of gory, over-the-top bit at the end, the rest of it is not over the top. Virtually every conversation that occurs in the film, I have either experienced myself or I've overheard being had by another Black person or another person of color. It's scary because it's real, and it's interesting how the film really frames how oppressive those sort of casual conversations, when built up and built up and built up, can really be. So again, it's really an honor to be part of a fierce group of family members, sisters, siblings who are really bringing consciousness to a really pervasive issue in our culture. So that's all out of me. I'm going to, I don't know if Kat, do you want to come on and say anything else, or can I just pass the baton right on to Tranisha, Arzah?
Just go ahead and pass.
Tranisha is about to dazzle and stun y'all and share some really important knowledge. So without further ado, thank you all so much for having me. Tranisha, take it away.
Thank you, Olivia. Can everyone hear me okay? I'm on my mic on the computer.
Yeah,
thank you. Oh, thank you. Thanks, Olivia, for all of that information. My name is Tranisha Arzah, and I will be also kind of diving into racial biases in the language that we use or have in our culture and everyday use. And hopefully people can hear me. I am congested, so it might be hard for me to pronounce or enunciate very well. And I'll try to be quick. There's a lot of information that I want to cover with you all, but yeah, we'll see if we can get through it all. Okay, so here are my objectives for this portion of the webinar. So the foundation of any collective action of any community is language. Language influences how we feel and how we react to things. Even more importantly, language influences how we understand things, what they mean to us, and how we relate to one another. Biased language, of course, refers to words and phrases that are considered prejudiced, offensive, and hurtful. And these biased languages can encompass expressions that demean or exclude people because of various things like age, sex, race, ethnicity, social class, and any physical or mental traits. But we are talking about race and language. So the relationship between race and language and racism plays key roles in reflecting and defining the way human societies are structured. And when I talk about language, this also embodies both power and privilege, and who is using language as agents of power, and how are they using it to maintain or increase their power. Unpacking coded language. What is coded language? Coded messages have words or symbols which represent other words, so that the message is secret unless you know the system behind the code. If someone is using a coded language, they are expressing their opinion in an indirect way, usually because the opinion is likely to offend people. And Olivia touched base on some of those coded language things, and I'll kind of dive in a little bit deeper about what that looks like. So what is racially coded language? Basically, it's a passive-aggressive racist statement. They hide obviously oppressive language by appearing as common vocabulary, good intentions, or seemingly objective common sense. But mostly they're just like really sneaky ways to be racially biased. Racially coded language is similar to microaggressions, which Olivia talked about in her portion really well, but rather than directed at a specific individual, these phrases are most often used in discussions around social issues and current events. So some examples of racially coded words I'm not going to go into all of these coded words, but I will share some kind of underneath definitions of some of these words. First, there's like shady or sketchy, which is actually used pretty common. And both of those terms have long referred to neighborhoods with heavily black or brown populations, promoting the stereotype that these communities are supposedly inherently unsafe and unwelcoming because of high crime or because of the area's racial makeup. I'm not sure if folks on the webinar remember seeing on the news, but there was a recent launched app called Sketch Factor, which was created by an all-white team to help users avoid sketchy or bad neighborhoods. But in reality, it's a tool to enable racial profiling. Yeah, wow. The terms will also refer to Black individuals who, judging solely by their appearance, may be untrustworthy or violent, perpetuating nasty racial stereotypes that Black people and minorities only want to steal from or attack white people. I'm gonna, let's see, welfare and food stamps, which we have all heard of, and maybe a lot of us access these resources. So this is was broadly supported during the New Deal era, when it was understood that people obviously face hardships in their lives that sometimes require government assistance. And in fact, this was supposedly limited to white recipients. Yet during the 1960s, Lyndon B. Johnson made it clear that he wanted to have a racial justice component. So since then, welfare and food stamps have been negatively switched towards Black folks as a sign of laziness when they access these resources. And it has still today been repeatedly said that the African American community are the highest recipients of this service, which statistically is not true. And another coded word I'm going to go into is illegal alien. This phrase is a perfect example of a racially coded word, which triggers about immigrants as criminals, taking advantage of welfare and disrespecting the American way of life. Exactly, no person's illegal. But somehow the concerns are always pointed at the Mexican border instead of the one we share with Canada. So this racial phrase about Latinos that is now being couched as the seemingly racially neutral language has harnessed to support fear to get people to support conservative policies. Awesome. And at the bottom are just some other racially coded words that I see really often. Black on black crime has been used a lot, especially in response to the Black Lives Matter movement, radical Islam, bossy, sassy, and uppity, religious freedom, and middle class. Yeah, I can explain the Shahari Law. So the Shahari Law, I don't know if I'm even pronouncing that right. We first started hearing about this alleged threat to American justice in the wake of September 11th. Sorry, my dog is scratching. September 11th attacks, when the Bush administration became intent on linking the war in Iraq to hijackers who were from Saudi Arabia. To get there, you convince America that this threat is internal as well. New brown immigrants are threatening the heartland. It's a threat. Basically, it's just a racial framework, but it's not reality. So they use the Shahari Law as to basically say that you have to be an extreme Islamic terrorist, which is not true. Shahari Law is not linked or supported to extreme terrorism. So middle class, someone asked about middle class. So middle class is actually directed towards white people, and so it was switched to get white people to vote and to understand a certain population a different way. So it's kind of a little tricky thing that we see being used to describe certain people. So examples of racially coded phrases. I'm going to go over, I'm going to go over 5 coded phrases people post most often on Facebook to excuse their racism. And Olivia did go over some of these things. One of them being not meaning to be racist. Example, I'm not a racist. If someone doesn't mean something to be racist, that doesn't mean that what they're saying isn't rooted in racism. In instances like these, the reminder, impact, not intent, which Olivia mentioned, is helpful. If you're saying something harmful, your good intention doesn't lessen that harm. Of course, I like to think of myself as a good person, but regardless of my goodness, I do or say things that aren't good. And I sometimes say things that are downright hurtful. But when our friends and families say something that is implicitly racist, it doesn't immediately take away their goodness. Illegal, which someone said people are not illegal exactly. This is used as illegal immigrant or illegal writing. Let's just not use illegal to describe people. Using illegal to describe people is a way to deny equality within the courts and other systems of bureaucracy. It's also just a racially loaded term. If a white American citizen commits a crime, they're not condemned to being an illegal person forever. We also need to think about how deeply racist history has informed such activities and behaviors performed by which people and are viewed as legal, such as looting, loitering, and rioting. Politically correct. Example, you're being too politically correct. Political correctness comes up a lot, even the spaces that I'm in, especially on social media. It's used mainly by racially privileged people in response to people of color who ask for more inclusive language. For example, Latinos asking for society to stop using the term illegal in relation to undocumented immigration or ghetto to describe neighborhoods with communities of color often results in people defending their right to use oppressive language by claiming that we're stifling under politically correctness. But using language that marginalized communities choose to be represented by and dropping language that makes people feel excluded isn't just about being politically correct. It's about using language that doesn't harm someone else and impress the entire community. Playing the race card. Example, stop playing the race card and making everything about race. So this phrase is often used when someone is sharing a specific experience around racial oppression, or when someone is adding a race lens to discussion of a social issue. Ultimately, this denies the plausibility of racism. It's not about race, it's about class. It's not about race, it's an isolated incident. Why are you making such a big deal out of this? You're reading too much into things. So when I hear those things, that basically says the implication of racism is not a big deal, or that it's an isolated incident, which denies the reality of both historical and current trauma. Basically, when someone's saying your experience of racism isn't real. And lastly, aggressiveness, aggressive and decisive. Example, can you be more polite? You're being aggressive and turning the cause into a decisive one. So this is called tone policing, and it ends up shifting the attention away from someone else's experience of oppression onto how they're supposed to react. I see this a lot when it comes to people not liking the way that a certain group of people are like protesting, which is a form of tone policing when they said they should do that at a different time or they shouldn't block traffic. That is one of those examples. Calling someone aggressive for expressing their experience of oppression basically implies, I don't care about your experience with oppression or how it makes you feel. I only care about how uncomfortable it makes me. And being a person of color, and specifically being a Black woman, the range of emotion I'm allowed to have is diminished by structure rules for our interactions along racial lines. We're unreasonably expected to be polite and nice when responding to or discussing oppression around race and gender. So linguistic racism and linguistic discrimination, I actually was the first time I actually heard this term before, but it basically talks more about the history of language. What is linguistic racism? It means when language is used to empower white dominant culture over against another racial group. And linguistic discrimination is the unfair treatment of an individual based solely on a person's use of language. Also, this use of language may include the individual's native language or other characteristics of that person's speech, such as an accent, the size of vocabulary, whether the person uses complex or varied words. Standard American English, or short SAE, is a privilege. It's not that all English is privilege. Instead, the U.S. tends to idolize Standard American English, essentially as a neutral non-accent, mostly associated with suburban Midwest. The discrimination against non-English languages and non-Standard American English accents manifests in many ways, some ways that we might not have thought of. And below are some of the examples of privileges that those who speak Standard American English have, and break down how this privilege harms non-Standard American English speakers. So one is, you're assumed to be American. The U.S. has no official language. There is no federal law that states that citizens must speak English. There are over 300 languages that are spoken as a first language in the U.S. And more than 60 million people in the U.S. speak a language other than English in their home. Nevertheless, often only those who speak English with American accents are assumed to be American. Two, your language affords you easy access to information. So we all go to the doctor's office, go to the school, go to restaurants, go to a realtor, maybe go to a courthouse, we go on the internet. In how many of those settings is English the only available spoken or written language? How are non-English speakers supposed to navigate these spaces? And how are they to gain equivalent access to education, healthcare, and criminal justice? And three, you're assumed to be intelligent, educated, and nonviolent. So no language or accent is inherently superior to another. Nevertheless, expressive and pervasive classism and racism in the U.S., certain accents and languages are associated with intelligence, whereas others are associated with violence. Yeah, all lives matter is definitely racist. Yes. Your accent is positively represented on TV and film. This one personally for me has been really, really hard. Even though there has been more representation of Black and brown folks this year on TV and film, historically there's a long history of that not being true. So on screen, how often does a CEO, a politician, a principal, a professor, a lawyer, any profession that we increase power of in the US, how often has a Spanish accent or a Av accent, which I will go into in the next slide, a Royal accent, an Arabic accent, a Valley Girl accent, and a Lisp, how often are those accents, languages represented on TV and film? Most elite characters have supposedly safe and intelligent sounding standard American English accents. And when it comes to non-standard American English accents, those roles go to our most harmful tropes, which all of us have seen. They go to the dangerous undocumented immigrant, the undereducated, the supposedly violent gang member, the unkept hillbilly or redneck, the Islamic terrorist, the ditzy blonde, the simpleton, or the overly feminine gay man. 5, your accent is not criticized or exaggerated. For this, I think I've heard of, people pretending to mimic a coworker of Asian descent saying ching chong, ching chong. That happens. And that's one of those examples of your accent being criticized or made fun of. Also, people overhear groups of predominantly white people making fun of African American vernacular English, which is that AV that I mentioned earlier. Appropriating phrases and pronunciations affiliated with urban Black culture. People might say, you're speaking Black, or speaking Black is done a certain way, and it's made fun of because of that. But these things are not just jokes. They're wrong, because mock languages are insulting a type of covert racism that vulgarizes non-privileged languages and accents. 6, your accent is not treated as exotic. American English speakers, how many times have you gone out of the country and been asked to say something in American? Never happened, right? But other people who live in America or come to America are always asked to say something in possibly their native language or a different language that they know. And I'm going to quickly go through the last 2. You're not misheard or purposely ignored because of your accent. People who have different languages or accents are usually dismissed or ignored because they're not taken seriously, because it's not a standard American English. And lastly, you're not forced to code switch. Because most people perceive standard American English accents as intelligent and nonviolent. For instance, folks are not forced to change the way they speak when at work or in a classroom or in a courthouse and so on. The same, though, does not apply to non-standard American speakers. Now, I know what some of you may be thinking, that's not a privilege. Everyone has to speak professionally in the workplace. But really, what does it mean to speak professionally? Sure, it means that unless I'm the boss, at least I can probably swear while at work. Probably can't swear while at work. But it also means that a specific accent and phrases are expected, whereas other accents and phrases are deemed unacceptable. So code switching. Because some African Americans speak a particular non-standard variety of English, which is often seen as substandard, African Americans are frequently the targets of linguicism. It's a really interesting term. African American vernacular English, or short AV, is often perceived by members of mainstream American society as indicative of low intelligence and limited education. It's also seen as lazy or bad English. Yeah, code switching is akin to passing. Yeah, I'll go a little deeper about that. So what does code switching have to do with av? Code switching is a response to this standard American English privilege that Black and Brown folks are impacted by. I have many friends and people in the my Black and Brown community that have to code switch depending on what space they're in. Very often, people of color code switch both consciously and unconsciously to act or talk more like those around them. While this can be effective, it can also be risky. With standard English as the accepted form of communication in America, it is a necessity for non-white folks to code switch in order to be successful. And that's not necessarily true for everyone, but for people of color that might seem like have a lot of truth to it. And below are some of 5 reasons why people of color may code switch. Our lizard brains take over, which I found really interesting. Lizard brains basically means it senses danger where your instincts and gut feelings originate. We want to fit in. Some people of color want to fit into spaces, so they code switch. Some people want to get something from someone else. We want to say something in secret, and it helps us convey a thought. So, hashtag PWS. Hashtag PWS means polite white supremacy, which is more humorous than anything. It's the notion that whites should remain the ruling class while denying that they are the ruling class. So, affectionately, it's called hashtag PWS for short. So why would someone use or say polite white supremacy rather than racism? First, saying hashtag PWS puts the responsibilities solely on the creators of systematic problem. Secondly, this phrase addresses the subtlety and casualness with which oppression is ministered. And thirdly, it eradicates the all too common confusion between racism and prejudice. It's important to eradicate this confusion so that we can be clear that racism is tied to a power structure and access to resources. And that's why language matters so much, because racism and being prejudiced, are not interchangeable. So for folks that might not understand the difference between the two, here are some short definitions. Racism is committed only by the ruling class and agents of the ruling class because they have the power that comes with racism. In America, the ruling class is white people of all classes. Prejudice, though harmful, is not necessarily systematic, and it can be committed by anyone. It simply requires one to prejudge. It does not require its user to have any access to the ruling class or status of whiteness. And I'm about to wrap this up. So with all of that contact information, how do we develop a shared language, which I'm sure we'll talk about after this portion of my slides, but I just want to say that this is an ongoing process, and that it means things are changing and that we are learning. So the first task is to embrace these changes in language of racism and join the community of learners, because there's lots of different community of learners who are trying to learn the language of racism. And I just want to say, simply learning the language of racism is not enough. Language empowers action, and actions that make a difference are our ultimate goal. And if folks join this webinar just with a concern about language and racism, hopefully they can examine that and challenge themselves to move from concern to action. And for others that have more of a sense of language and racism and race playing in our society, examine what you can do more to combat racism in language. I'll end with this. And who is next? Thank you.
Thank you, Tranisha. That was amazing. Kari, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yep, thanks. Sorry, I was stuck on mute. So, I get tasked with summing up our webinar, which I think speaks for itself. I'm so thankful that Kat and Olivia and Tranisha were able to present on this webinar, and hopefully everyone learned new things and has new context for old concepts. We really, as Kat described earlier, are trying to kind of have this two-pronged approach to these conversations. So that are multifaceted, right? But we're trying to have these two prongs where we heard from our sisters that white women really needed to be more actively involved in identifying and understanding and challenging and helping to change systematic and cultural and community levels of racism that exist. And in doing that, we created, the curriculum and the discussion groups that will happen throughout the year and hopefully beyond that, specifically for white women. And then this piece, this webinar series, was kind of the second prong, which was really to create forums and space like this webinar so that we can hear from amazing presenters and really have a dialogue in a safe environment with great context about these pieces that impact racism, like the history and the language and culture and the social frameworks that many people deal with on a daily basis, and many others, especially white folks, may be unaware of. And the hope is to kind of offer these platforms that create safe spaces for us to all broaden our knowledge and come together to really change on a structural level racism. Because, it just takes a few, right, to create a movement. And really in addressing, this language piece, we thought it was really important because this is something that oftentimes I appreciate that Olivia had in her slides, the million cuts, right? Many times the language is so easy to shake off, or we have 100 other things to do and you don't have the energy to address it, or maybe you don't even realize that some of these things are rooted in racism and bias and privilege and exclusion, and that they build into the normalization of racism and racist structures and discrimination. I appreciate everybody that's already been on here sharing a lot of resources and asking a lot of questions. And it looks like Tranisha can share some more references from her slides too if folks want to do some more research in terms of how language plays into this. Our first webinar was on power and privilege and race, and really kind of laying down historical context. And we wanted to dig a little bit deeper in terms of language. PWN has and PWN members have really been groundbreaking in identifying language that's stigmatizing and impedes the cause for people living with HIV. And we thought that bringing in this language piece when we're talking about race and racism was really important. And hopefully you all have gained things from this webinar. I know I have. Are there other questions or comments or examples that people would like to share or ask at this point? We have a few minutes left. If there's something that you're just burning to say, I think the phones are muted, but I believe you can hit *6 to unmute your line, or you can ask.
All attendees are muted and may unmute themselves by pressing *6.
There you go, *6. Or you can ask in the chat box, and I think any of the presenters
or myself and Kat are happy to field questions. I'm now catching up on what you all were talking about in the chat box. Is there anybody that has something they want to add or a question that they'd like to ask, something that you want more clarification on, something we didn't discuss? So we, by no means was this supposed to be an inclusive, complete, final list of the ways that language impacts, but coded language and microaggressions, I think, were a great jumping off point. A lot of times things intersect to create, multiple ways that language is used to dismiss behavior or dismiss racism or discrimination. And so those were just two of the most prominent. We could go on and on with different examples that combine lots of things. Sarah, did you want to come off mute and ask, or did you, I think you're saying, oh no, never mind, you're asking a question in the box. If nobody has any questions that they want to ask out loud, looks like there's still lots of conversation happening in the chat box, but we will conclude our webinar. Going once.
So this is Kat. Olivia posted in the chat box, we talked about the difference between passing and code switching. And for those people who are on their phones, there might be a few who are not on the webinar. I would love for Tranisha, Olivia, both of you, either of you, to expand on that a little bit or give the explanation that you gave in the chat box. I think that's really important information.
Awesome. Thanks, Kat.
Tranisha, you want to take it?
If you're talking to Olivia.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay. Oh,
yeah, we can hear you, Olivia.
So awesome. Thank you so much for asking, Kat. Yeah, passing and code switching, like I said in the chat box, are kind of like cousins, I guess, but maybe distant cousins, because passing, kind of by definition, is attempting to, and these are again kind of similar to what Kari was just saying about not, I'm not going to give like the most comprehensive definition now because these are extraordinarily complicated concepts, but simply put, passing is this notion of actively attempting to be perceived as a race or ethnicity other than the one that you are, that a person is. Like a very light-skinned black person. I mean, there have been films about this. There's stuff written about it. There is a book called Passing by Nella Larson, who's an African-American author, and tons of other stuff because it's, kind of a part of our history, but, sort of very folks who can quote-unquote pass, very light-skinned people, kind of living as white people or attempting to live as white people. And this happens with, kind of Latino folks, and it gets complicated also because some people say, well, Latino is not a person, it's not an identity of color, even within the Latino community. Some people, the Latinx community, some people would say, well, some of us are white, we identify as white. It's complicated. This stuff is all very complicated. But the idea of passing is I know that I'm this race, this is how I was raised, and I'm going to actively, sort of try to be perceived as another race. Whereas, for all sorts of reasons, whether it's, to make a living or to, or maybe they do in all parts of their lives, and they like cut ties with their families, or they just do it sort of in the workplace. I would hazard a guess that the practice is less common than it was at past times in history. But then we get to, sort of actively passing, leaving your family behind, living in a different city, not letting them see that you, have black people in your family. That was a book, Rachel Dolezal. Oh, yeah, I was thinking Rachel Dolezal is kind of like the reverse of that because she is a white woman who is convinced that she is black. She was raised by white people in a white community, and says that she is black, and takes sort of energy and and book deals and sort of attention off of people who actually are black people to sort of focus on her as a person who is actually not black, but appears to believe that she is based on no black experience. other than that she has sort of like put herself in. I think it just came out. Now, code switching is different. Code switching is kind of like an everyday thing that, and I put an article that I really love in the, or an article that references a speech, which is also available in text that I really, really love, that the author Zadie Smith, who's a black British author, did about President Obama when he was first inaugurated, showing how he code switches within a single speech. Like he'll sort of speak kind of drawing more from his roots as a black man. He'll draw more from kind of the language that he was acculturated to as an Ivy League student. You can hear it in this really kind of like textured way in the way that he speaks, which is of course new to the presidency, because we've never had a president really who code switched. But it can also even can kind of apply across the board. I feel like I'm talking a lot. I apologize. It's complicated stuff, but I'll wrap it up. The way that people, sort of speak with their, kind of communities of origin or chosen communities, and, kind of more publicly or in workplaces, is sort of an example of code switching, and someone can do it sort of within the course of an hour. It's not like necessarily like a life choice, but it's definitely a life practice that a lot of people of color are very familiar with. Did that make sense? Follow-up questions or anything? Tranisha, do you want to add anything? I don't know if that was like a good piece. Okay.
That was really helpful.
That was great, Olivia. Thank you for that. There's so many terms that, like you said, are distant cousins around code switching. There's also like code mixing and crossing, and again, they're just used in different ways depending how folks need to relate to others or fit in a certain situation. So, they're related, but they're not all the same things. But what you said was perfect.
Cool. Thank you. Thanks for that.
Thank you. This is Jenny. I just wanted to add something because earlier someone was asking Tranisha about Sharia law, and I just wanted to kind of add something to what she was saying, because this is actually something that's come up in my own with my parents. So I've had to discuss this before. So one of the things about with Sharia law, like that's referring to law that's based on the Quran, so like theocratic law. And when they talk about Sharia law here, and you hear about like state legislatures passing resolutions against Sharia law, it's this ridiculous notion that somehow this whatever tiny percentage of the population that is Muslim is somehow going to overthrow and dominate our legal and political system and impose Sharia law, impose law based on the Quran on the United States. It doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It is racist. It's just completely ludicrous. And no one is attempting to do any such thing. And even if they wanted to, there would be no such power as in today's society and in today's government for any such thing to even happen. So it's just an excuse for Islamophobic rhetoric, and it just incites hate. It just gets people. It just makes people angry and geared up to hate Muslims, and it's a really despicable thing. So anytime you hear anyone talking about Sharia law, they really need to be shut down.
So it looks like Heather has a question in the chat box that says, I'm curious if there's any language you read in the news that you'd highlight as horrible, or is it simply reprinting coded racist language without calling it out? Anybody want to take a crack at that?
Great question.
Good question. Yeah, excellent question. I'm kind of puzzling out, like everything Trump says, but I'm trying to be more specific, and like point out a specific example.
Wait, can someone clarify the question for me? So is it about...
What was that?
I was trying to understand the question a little better. Is it about describing something that Trump said that relates to what was it? Racist language.
This is Heather. Hi, everybody. I'm curious if there's language that you would point out that you read in the news, and I'm thinking particularly around, as some of you know, I'm working on a story on HIV criminalization, so I'm thinking of, obviously I write about HIV, but also there seems to be a lot of layers to how we talk about HIV that kind of doesn't go into, the structural racism involved in why people have the outcomes they have, et cetera. I mean, I'm not here to get us on a dissertation of why that happens. I just wonder if there's particular language that you would point out. I just want to try to avoid any racist language that I possibly can in my articles. And if this is too self-centered, I'm happy to take this out of the group. It doesn't need to be in the group if necessary.
No, I would love to keep talking to you about it more as kind of more examples occur to me personally. But I do think it's an important question for the group. And Lauren actually put an answer in the chat box. The concept of the welfare mother, who's usually perceived as being Black, even though statistically I've heard the majority of families on welfare are white. Yes, absolutely. I mean, statistically, absolutely. And in terms of that example, a lot of the examples that Tranisha made in her presentation definitely apply here. I'm trying to think of it specifically sort of coded language that comes up a lot around kind of around mass incarceration and, kind of HIV criminalization. Because it's true, I think that as a community that's talking about and dealing with HIV criminalization, I think that we even as a community are on a journee of incorporating kind of a racial justice lens to the way that we do HIV criminalization work. The way, to see it sort of as part of the kind of overall scheme of mass incarceration of Black and brown people and of queer people. Specifically of Black and brown people. So I think it's a really important ongoing conversation. I'm really wanting to give you a good answer here and have a little gem, this is something that comes up a lot in articles and avoid this. But I am going to model not knowing, and let's keep talking about it because I'm not thinking of any examples. Anybody else on the call? Jenny, Tranisha, anything that you've sort of come across quite a lot in your travels in terms of kind of racially coded language to avoid around criminalization?
And
so I don't know that.
May I offer something? Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
This is Heather. And the only thing that I can think of off the top of my head is not so much about language, but more about what experiences we center as writers, I think there's a tendency to center the stories of white middle-aged gay men with HIV who have private insurance when, it seems like we need to really be prioritizing and putting it in it seems more like it's not so much an issue of language per se and more of context of the context of mass incarceration and that sort of thing. So that's the only thing I can think. That's the only thing I've come up with.
I think that's really that's actually a really important point.
Yeah,
because I think they also, when they talk about, for example, if they talk about somebody who's a suspect of something, has been arrested for something or convicted of something, when it's a person of color, there's definitely more of a focus on any possible transgression they've ever committed in their life. And then if it's, a well-off white kid who's accused of raping someone, they talk about, that he's on the swim team and he's a good student and he's never been in trouble in his life. And, it's, there's definitely.
And how it will hurt his future.
What we share and don't share and how we share it is definitely important.
Yeah.
And
actually, I think that's to veggie back off of what you were saying, I I thought of an example specifically around the way that we talk about HIV criminalization. I think that there's a tendency to highlight. I did say veggie back. I don't want to be on the back of the pig, so to really highlight the kind of the goodness and the spotlessness of people's experience when we talk about them being criminalized because of their HIV status, as if to say that because they were with, they used a condom, they had an injectable viral load, they had one partner, they weren't promiscuous, they didn't do drugs, like the same kinds of kind of microaggressions that came up in what I was talking about in my part of the presentation get reproduced to suggest that there are people who deserve to be prosecuted because of their HIV status. No one ought to be criminalized because of a health condition that they have. This is the issue that we run into in language and messaging around the Michael Johnson case, because it's clearly not this quote unquote perfect case of someone who had sex one time in their life. I mean, he was a sexually active gay man, black gay man, in a rural area where they had very little access to health information and he had very little information about the condition that he was living with, and neither did anyone that he was having sex with, it would appear. So, really, so it's sort of highlighting those cases as if there are people who it suggests that sort of we have a long way to go in terms of figuring out how to be inclusive in our messaging around people who, essentially the way that I often put it, who do things that you wouldn't do, basically, that you or I wouldn't do, basically, or that I have done. It's not even about things that you and I would, but just sort of talking, sort of as we're having a conversation about messaging. Basically, it comes down to people's feelings about behavior. And the bottom line that I would love to see us all sort of adopt is that no one deserves to be prosecuted because of a health condition they're living with. Period. So that's something that comes up, and that is very much racially coded. It's coded around, kind of perceptions of sexuality. So that was one example that I thought of.
This is Laurel. I wonder if I could add one quick thing to this conversation.
Yes. Hi, Laurel.
Hi, you guys. I'm on the phone. I finally figured out how to unmute it. Despite being questions. The only thing I would add to this conversation about coded language in media reporting around criminalization is that I would really love it if the journalists and writers on this topic had some good understanding of how sexuality, I think Olivia was just saying this, how sexuality of Black bodies has been constructed and used and fetishized, how Black sexuality has been fetishized. Because I think we certainly saw it with Michael Johnson in Missouri, but I think it plays out in really different ways for Black women who are criminalized, and we almost never even hear the stories. And I think part of that idea, part of it is the invisibility that you were mentioning, and part of it is, I think, this idea that we have just such really terrifying ideas about Black women's sexuality, in part around what women deserve, how valuable their bodies are, how to handle domestic violence narratives that often fit in with these HIV criminalization stories. So if our journalists were really knowledgeable about that, so that those underlying coded languages around sexuality in Black bodies were able to be deconstructed a bit, I think that would go a long way toward more humanizing reporting.
Yeah, that's great. That's challenging, and it's great.
All right, I'm going to mute again. Thanks for letting me join in for a moment.
That was awesome.
So we have about 2 minutes. I just threw my comment in the chat box because I think I can't say anything better in terms of the complexities around mass incarceration and people of color and coded language and microaggressions that are sometimes small and sometimes very overt when we talk about HIV criminalization. The piece that consistently resonates for me is the complexity of getting our own community, let alone other people who may be allies or not, on the same page in terms of terminology around HIV and what terminology in itself that we use often, like infected, or infecting others is so stigmatizing and carries such a burden all on its own. So I would also point out that PWN has done a lot of work around language matters specifically for HIV that may be helpful as well for your article, Heather. And I don't know, I'm sorry that I haven't read your pieces, so you could be amazingly brilliant and not need that. But I think
I'm sure
really
we all need it. Yeah.
As well.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So I appreciate everyone's questions and your time. I'm super excited. I can't wait for our next installment of this series. So it will happen at some point in May. We don't have a specific date determined yet, but stay tuned. We'll post and share as we did for this one when we have our next webinar. And I thank everybody, I thank the presenters for all of your time and the participants for all of your amazing questions. And I'm so thankful to be surrounded by such amazing people. Did anyone want to say anything else before we sign off?
This is Kat. I just want to say that you all inspire me. Amazing job to all the presenters and for all of you people who were attending and listening in and chatting and all of that. I'm just totally inspired, so thank you.
Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to be here, and I'm extraordinarily inspired by all of y'all as well and by our participants, and thank you so much for engaging and being present and continuing to be present. And thank you so much to WPDR for continuing to lead the way in our community around this work. So, yes.
Thanks to Joni, too, who was like, I'm not presenting anything, am I, as we started? And I was like, no, but you're making sure all our technology works. Which is very important.
I saw myself on the presenter side, and I was like, wait a minute, I didn't prepare anything.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, ladies. Have a great day.
Thank you all. Have a good night. Talk to you soon.
Yeah, take care, everyone.